Hello everyone, I'm Mike Cahill and welcome to another installment of Hatfield Currents, an HCTV show produced by Hatfield TBD Productions. As you probably know, Hatfield Currents is really a public service show, and we explore topical issues facing the community, and we introduce town officials and leaders, business leaders to the community, and we showcase residents who from time to time have some interesting personal or town-related stories to tell. Today's show is the first of a couple of shows dealing with the upcoming May 14th annual town meeting. At this point, it's likely that the warrant will include several articles dealing with projects proposed to be funded by our Community Preservation Act program. And I'm going to shorten this throughout the show by, rather than saying Community Preservation Act, I'll say CPA, short for Community Preservation Act. The goal of today's show is to bring you up to speed on the proposed CPA articles, with a focus on one article in particular. But before getting into the articles, what we'd like to do is quickly brief you on the background of the CPA program in Hatfield and how it works. To help with all of this, we've got several members of the town's CPC here, that's the Community Preservation Committee, here with us, and they will help talk to us about the program and how it's funded, give us a little background on the CPA program in town. We also have several guests whose agencies would be involved in one of the CPA projects that we will talk about more today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bob Wagner, who is the chair of the Community Preservation Committee.
That's right.
That's the committee that oversees the administration of the CPA program. In the middle here, we have Laura Baker. Laura is a consultant with the Valley Community Development Corporation.
Correct.
Sited in Northampton.
Yes.
And she is specializes, I guess, in the affordable housing consulting for your organization. And then we have Mike McGrath, who is the chair of the Hatfield Housing Authority, and also you're a member of the CDC as well, right?
Right.
All right. So we've got three guests that are going to help us get into this program a little bit more and help us shed some light on some of the articles that are going to be proposed for the annual town meeting on the 14th of May. So I want to welcome all you guys to Hatfield Currents.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before getting into the articles, I thought, Bob, what we would do is talk briefly about the CPA program itself and kind of how it started and how it gets funded and some of the projects that funds have been applied towards, those kinds of things. So
Sure.
why don't you give us some background on it?
Sure. Well, we passed the Community Preservation Act, or CPA, in 2006. And it was first brought up at town meeting that year. And so once adopted by town meeting, the law requires that it then be considered by a vote of the electorate in town. So it was voted on in November of 2006 and passed at that point. But because of when we passed it and falling in the middle of a fiscal year and then having to wait for a full collection of CPA funds, we actually first started to receive money from our CPA funds locally and then a state match in fiscal year 2008. So we've actually we just completed our fifth full fiscal year of CPA.
Right. So let's talk briefly about how it works. Now, it's my understanding that the CPA is it's an add to our property taxes. It's in effect a surcharge that is a small percentage, is only applied to the value of our properties, if you will, in excess of $100,000. And what was the other thing I was thinking about? There's a state match.
That's right. Sure. Yeah. So so you're correct. It's a surcharge on the tax bill. It's not and the first $100,000 of assessed value is exempt from the CPA. the assessors and the folks at Town Hall, they will determine what the tax bill is on that amount of property value over $100,000.
Right.
And then we elected a 3% surcharge. It can be anywhere from basically 0% up to 3%, no more than 3%. Right. And that's an important distinction, which I can get to, because it gets to your other point, and that is there's a state match. Right. So the way the state set up the program is that it encourages communities to consider CPA and adopt this local surcharge, which raises local money. And then the state commits to matching up to 100%, but only if the funding is available, what is raised locally. And so in the first few years of CPA, when there weren't many communities around the state that were that had a program, the state was regularly matching at 100%. Mm-hmm. Okay. Once the funding for the trust fund, the state trust fund, started to dip a little bit, they had to scale back on how much they matched. But what they did was, for every community that is raising local funds at the 3% surcharge, there are up to 2 more rounds of funding in any one year. Oh, okay. So typically, the last 2 to 3 years, the state is matched in the first round at about 25%. So every community is guaranteed of getting a 25% return on their local money. Okay. You then if you're a 3% community, you can go through the next 2 rounds, obviously 2 and 3, which Hatfield regularly does, and as a result, we're seeing matches closer to 88%. So in the 5 fiscal years that we've been getting a state match, our total state match is at 94%. Because the first 2 years we got at 100%, and then the last 3 years have been in the upper 80s.
Let's talk just a little bit about absolute dollars.
Right.
Okay. Just on average, over the course of, maybe you don't have this number at your fingertips, over the course of the last 4 years since inception, I guess. What is the average amount of surcharge, if you will, from the community that's been raised per year?
Right. We typically raise about $105,000 to $110,000 a year from our surcharge. Okay. And then since we're getting close to 88%, or in a couple of years 100%, I can tell you actually that in the 5 full fiscal years, we've raised $545,000, $546,000 locally, and $514,000 from the state. So we've raised in excess of $1 million over those 5 years. Okay. With close to half of that, almost half of that coming from the state.
Okay. So what have we spent this money on? Right. I'm not asking you to detail every single project, but how about some of the major projects?
Well, actually, to preface that question, I think it's important for people to understand that the state requires that 10% of the money each year be set aside in each of 3 categories for the main 3 categories of projects that are eligible for CPA funding: historic preservation, open space preservation, and community housing. So 10% of your money raised, both locally and state match, have to be set aside each year, either spent or set aside and carried forward in each of those 3 categories. The remaining money is put in what's called a general reserve account, and that can be used for any of those 3 areas of interest and recreation. So there are actual 4 categories of projects. So to your question, most of the funds that we have spent to date have been in the historic preservation category. For example, one of the very first projects we funded was a $24,000 to $25,000 grant to the Congregational Church to renovate and rehabilitate their front columns, as well as the interior of the bell tower, or the steeple, which is where our town clock and bell resides. We've actually had 3 individual projects to restore and rehabilitate elements of Town Hall, which is a historic structure under CPA. We've in the open space category, folks may remember that we purchased 2 parcels for a total of about 35 acres on Chestnut Mountain Road in our watershed, drinking watershed reservoir area. So those two areas are now protected. They possibly could have been cabin lots or something like that.
Right.
So that was great project out there. In the recreation category, we have two projects that were approved at last town meeting. And both of them are in the works, but we haven't seen them completed yet, but we're pretty excited about them. One is to actually develop and maintain a hiking trail on town-owned land in West Hatfield. That'll be open to the public. And then the other one actually is to create a basketball court and recreation area on the site of the old School Street Elementary School. Yes. Right. So actually we've run the gamut of all of the project categories. For example, restoring some of the historic table monuments in the Hill Church, Hill Cemetery behind the Legion. And I think it's important to point out, because I mentioned projects being approved at last year's town meeting. Mike and I, as you mentioned in the introduction, are both members of the Community Preservation Committee. There's 9 of us on the committee. 7 of those positions are actually dictated by state law, in that you have to have certain representatives from different committees in town represented on the CPC. And then we have 2 at-large members. One appointed by the Board of Selectmen, the other one appointed by the moderator. So we accept and review and consider applications for funding, and we approve applications by committee, which are then presented on the warrant article for town meeting. No funding and no allocation of money is made unless those projects are approved by town meeting. So even though we may approve a project, it's up to town meeting to actually give it their seal of approval before any funding gets allocated.
Okay, all right. Do you have any idea at this point, you spoke to the fact that between local funds and state funds that CPA has raised somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million in the last 4 years or so. Do you have any idea, and then we've got, in a sense, 4 buckets for that money.
Right.
What the balances are in these buckets, if you will, these categories, as we approach the annual town meeting this year?
Sure. These numbers will change a little bit, obviously, as we're collecting money this year and then get a state match in October. But currently, we have about $500,000 in that general reserve, the larger fund. The open space category has about $75,000 in it. As I mentioned earlier, most of our projects have been historic preservation projects, so there's only about $12,500 in that account. And then the community housing account has close to $100,000 in it. So that doesn't mean that you're limited to, say, only doing a historic preservation project for $12,000, because you can access some of the money in the general reserve.
Okay.
So you're not limited to the amount that's in each account.
Okay. So that's the case with any of those 3 other categories. Community housing, for example, can access the money in that general reserve, if you will.
And recreation, for example, can only access funding in the general reserve. Okay. Because they don't have an allocation, separate category of allocation. Okay. Yep.
All right, good. Well, I think that that's kind of a helpful beginning and a perspective to know about the program and how it works and how it's funded and what our balances are as we go into town meeting. So let's talk about the town meeting articles. At this point, although the selectmen have not finalized the articles, the warrant for town meeting, but we're anticipating that there may be 5.
That's right.
5 articles.
Yeah. So the Community Preservation Committee advanced 5 projects and have drafted articles for the Board of Selectmen's review for this town meeting. And I'll just go over them really quickly, if that's fine with you.
No,
okay.
That's what I'd like to do.
So the first one actually is an exciting project for us, because it actually covers 3 categories of funding for CPA: historic preservation, recreation, and to some extent open space preservation. And that is a project that was first submitted by the Open Space Committee in conjunction with the Smith Academy trustees, and that is up to $10,000 to fund the preliminary design of a new layout for the Smith Academy Park.
The old Smith Academy
The old
Park.
Smith Academy Park, which is at the corner of School and Main Street there. And the idea being that that area could be turned into something that perhaps is provides more opportunity for community engagement, in particular having a gazebo there for band concerts and performances, things of that sort. Okay. So that one would actually run across all three categories, that's always nice if you can sort of combine the allocations or the categories in one project.
That's just for monies for the design aspect of that project.
That's right, exactly. Okay. We have another historic preservation project, which is actually year 2 of a historical museum collection management and preservation project. As many people in town know, we have a Hatfield Historical Museum. Right. Has just a voluminous number of artifacts and items dating back to the early years of Hatfield, pre-Civil War.
George actually shared some of those with us in an earlier Hatfield.
Yeah, sure. So it's much more than a grandma's attic. I mean, it's really quite a stunning collection. Yeah. But there's so much in there, and there's been a lot of advancement both in database management systems as well as in preservation and restoration techniques, that we really needed to be able to go through the entire collection to see what indeed we have, to catalog it correctly, to also then identify items that either could be moved out of the collection or needed to be restored in order to stay in the collection. So this is funding to actually do that inventory work. And so we adopted an article last year to do the initial work, year 1, and Kathy Gow, the curator for the museum, has come back with a $19,000 proposal to complete the project for a second year.
Okay. So does this include software as well that Kathy's using, or you mentioned
it's
digitizing a lot of stuff?
Yeah, I can't accurately say that we paid for the software. I don't think we did. Okay. What we're paying for is her and an assistant curator to actually catalog all of the materials in software database so that they can actually produce a single sheet data, content management page that has a picture of the item, who contributed it, its years, what historical significance it has, which is very helpful, particularly for researchers, either students here in town or people that are researching history of Hatfield or the Connecticut River Valley, be able to come to us and we can get our hands on things right away.
Right. And is there likely to be a third phase of this, Bob, or did you mention
yeah, Michael, do you remember
is there a preservation phase or more?
There'd definitely be preservation phases to this going forward. Restoration. Yeah, this is just the inventory part of it. Yeah. We have a project that actually I am personally very interested in because I also serve on the Ag Committee in town, the Ag Advisory Committee. Right. And so the Ag Advisory Committee submitted a proposal to actually set aside up to $40,000 of our open funding from CPA for a town contribution to, and I'll use another acronym here, the APR projects in town, or Agricultural Preservation Restriction Projects. This is a state program that allows farmers to voluntarily sell a conservation easement on their land that would permanently protect it into the future. And we have about 300 acres, or actually more, about 500 acres of land in town already in the program. The Williams Farm, for example, the Luther Belden Farm is a good example. The state requires communities to provide at a minimum, a 5% match for APR projects. We have no source of funding in town to make that contribution other than CPA funding. So this would enable us to actually provide matches to projects that may come up throughout the year to protect farmland in town. In fact, that $40,000 using the 5% match would actually attract another $760,000 from the state because the total would be $800,000. So there's a lot of really nice leverage with that project.
Yeah. And how did you arrive at the, let's put it this way, how did we arrive at the 800,000 APR level? I mean, is that likely to be a 1 year thing or something that's, how would we anticipate this lasting more than 1 year?
Yeah, I think it would. I think it would. We spoke with representatives at the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources about the interest in the program here in town and some outstanding applications that are going through the system.
Right.
And so based on that, we took a gauge of about a 2 to maybe 3 year period that this fund would accommodate over that, the projects and proposals that are coming through.
Okay.
So, and it would not be a recurring program. So for example, if we spent down the 40,000 in 1 or 2 years or even 3 years and we wanted to do it again, we'd have to
vote.
Have to come back to another vote. Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm going to hold the project that Laura and Mike are here to talk about for last. So the other project is another project at a town hall. And this is to do some rehabilitation work at Town Hall, which is eligible for CPA funding because it's a historic building within a historic district in town. Right. So we've done other projects in the past, for example, providing funding for the roof, redoing the roof on Town Hall, funding towards Americans with Disability Act handicap ramps and handicap bathrooms, and also funding towards an ADA elevator. Now, those two projects aren't completed, but the funding has been set aside for those. So this would be another project related to rehabilitation of Town Hall. The idea there, and this is an important thing for people to understand, is that the Community Preservation Act and the state saw this when it created the program. The idea of enabling historic town-owned buildings to continue to be available to the community. So if a town-owned building, like a town hall, needs to be ADA compliant and the funding isn't there, then you may lose use of that building.
Right.
And so this provides the opportunity, even though that might not be restoring a historic element of town hall, you are ensuring that a historic building continues to be available for public use.
Right, right. Yeah, good purpose.
Yep.
Good purpose. So specifically, what kinds of improvements is this going to be geared to in the town hall?
So,
do you know?
Well,
at this point, or is this up to the selectmen?
Yeah, that one is still being discussed, but we have sort of a placeholder of $85,000 for that project.
Okay.
So, and then that brings us to the fifth project, which I'll just very briefly introduce, and then we can go to your other guests.
Sure.
As you asked in the beginning of the program about the three categories, we have to date used funding for open space category, the historic preservation category, and we've done to date 2 recreation projects utilizing the general reserve fund for the recreation, particularly the basketball court recreation area, the School Street School. We to date have not done any community housing projects. So we've been accumulating funds, as the law requires, the 10% a year, in our community housing category or reserve.
So there's approximately $100,000.
About $100,000 in that.
Yep.
And so working with the Housing Authority, a proposal is being presented to actually create a senior housing mortgage assistance program. In a sense, a buy-down program of, we're thinking we have the budget for 2 units of senior housing within a senior housing project here in town. And that particular project is the largest one this year, and that's $270,200 based on the costs of the 2 mortgage assistance as well as related closing costs and administration costs, so that the whole package is being presented, would be presented to the voters at town meeting. So since we have Laura and Mike with us,
All right.
If you have any general questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them, but if you want to get into specifics,
No,
I'd like
let's you know, I think it's just good to get into this and talk about, you know, exactly how this would work and who would be eligible and so Laura, you know, how does something like this work? You know, Bob talked about $270,000 more or less. He talked about some closing costs, but he was using this term mortgage buy down.
Right.
You know, what does that mean?
Well, the idea is that some CPA money would be used to bring the acquisition cost of 2 senior housing condo units down.
Sure.
And the goal is so that senior households on a limited, fixed, modest income can afford to purchase these condo units.
Right.
And the committee has kind of had its eye on the Elm Street Village, Hatfield Village units,
Okay.
which are new construction, limited to people 55 and over. And the kind of lowest cost on those condo units is $240,000, which is unaffordable to many senior households.
Right.
And so the committee is proposing applying a $125,000 assistance amount per unit to reduce the acquisition cost for 2 households. The mechanism that would be used, essentially the CPA money would act sort of like a grant to the households who are acquiring the condo units, and it would be secured with a deed restriction on the property. So if you bought one of these condo units, you would be signing off on a deed rider that would live at the Registry of Deeds. And it would stipulate if you went to sell the units in the future, you would not be able to have some windfall profit from having this earlier grant. You would need to sell the units basically for a price that's affordable to the next buyer in a similar manner. And that you would be required to sell to a household that was income eligible. And so for folks that would participate in this program, there will be some restrictions, one having to do with the age of the buying household. We're looking at households that have at least one member who's 55 years or older. I think we'll be looking at giving a preference to households that are 2 people or larger, as opposed to single-person households, because of the size.
2-bedroom units.
Because of the size of the units that are under consideration. There would be a restriction on your annual income of approximately $45,000 for a 1-person household and approximately $52,000 for a 2-person household. And the other restriction would be on your assets, that you would not be allowed to have more than $75,000 in general assets, with the exception that you might have up to $200,000 in equity in your primary residence, which you would be selling in order to buy one of these condo units.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the basic parameters of it.
The income parameters, I'm assuming that's associated with eligibility.
Yes.
How about on an ongoing basis as they own the property?
Right.
Can their income increase?
Yes.
Can their asset base increase?
Yes. This is income, an income profile. It's taken as a snapshot at the time of acquisition. There is no rechecking of people's income in the future. You know, the reality is for these households, there's probably not going to be a lot of fluctuation in income. Most of these folks will be living on fixed incomes, will probably be retired at this point when they're looking to sell the big house and kind of downsize into something more manageable. Right. And, you know, one of the goals is to allow, you know, your longtime Hatfield residents to live in town as long as they possibly can in a unit that's manageable for them, not some very large, drafty farmhouse. This is a practical option for people, especially as we all are tending to live well into our 80s and 90s these days.
Right. So let's talk about, you know, this is in a sense, a kind of a quasi grant from the townspeople, the taxpayers in the community, helping other taxpayers in the community, if you will. Does the town have some sort of a lien on this property? Suppose for some reason these people end up getting into real financial problems, can't carry the mortgage, the thing ends up being foreclosed, or they go bankrupt. you know, is that money protected?
Yes, it is protected. And the main mechanism that protects it is the deed rider that I mentioned,
Right.
which is recorded at the Registry of Deeds. It's linked to a mortgage so that it will not be legally possible for people to sell or dispose of the units
Right.
without there being some accounting for the grant money that went into it.
Right.
It's not envisioned that people would necessarily repay these grants. It's envisioned that the grant would basically live with the unit
Right.
and pass along to the next buyer. The deed rider would be for 99 years. So even though the grant seems large at the front end for a household, you have to envision that it's going to follow for 4, 5, 6 generations of buyers over time,
Right.
and hopefully benefit many different households over time that way.
Right. Now, how about the you mentioned a little bit about eligibility requirements and parameters. Would there be a preference to people who live in the community for this program?
And
if not, the second question tied to that is, suppose no one in Hatfield is interested.
Right. Well, let's see. We intend to participate in a state program that's called the Local Initiative Program. This will allow Hatfield to count these units on something that's called the Subsidized Housing Inventory that is maintained at the state level. The state encourages each city and town to have a 10% supply of affordable housing in its community, meaning housing that has some kind of restriction on it, that it has to be affordable, not just that it's cheap.
Yeah.
And currently in Hatfield, that is percentage is about 3.3%, so it's well below the target that the state sets. It's not uncommon for small towns to have that situation.
Right.
So
are we under a time frame to achieve?
You are not
to
under,
move that up at all?
There is no time frame to achieve it. The state has sometimes made some of its funding contingent or given preferences for communities that have been successful. So with achieving that 10% goal.
And what funding, when you mention funding, what state funding would be at risk, if you will, or problematic if the town doesn't begin to make strides towards meeting that threshold?
Yeah,
is that Chapter 70 money? Is that Community Preservation Act money?
It's mostly more discretionary programs that they've looked at. So recreation, open space, housing, other kinds of community programs.
Okay.
So it's an advantage for a community to be at that 10%. It's an advantage for the community itself to be having a supply of housing that reaches across a range of incomes. Particularly for seniors, because the majority of Hatfield seniors have modest incomes based on census data. So one of the things that the committee looked at was whether this program would match the profile of people living in Hatfield. So your question is, is there a requirement to be a Hatfield resident? And because of participation in this state program, the town will be limited in terms of how many units it can restrict to local residents. It can restrict up to 70% of the units in its program. Now, in a program of 2 units, that means that one of them can be restricted to Hatfield, to local residents. And the state will...
half of the other one.
And yes. And the state defines that as people who are living in Hatfield or working in Hatfield. So assuming that there are more interested parties than units, which I would anticipate with a program that has only 2 units.
Right. And given our population base and the demographics.
There would be a lottery conducted for each unit. And in the lottery for one unit would give a preference for local residents. And the other lottery would be called open, but local residents could also participate. So if you're a local resident, you have an advantage in the local preference pool, but you also get to participate in the open pool. It doesn't guarantee that one or both units will go to Hatfield residents, but it certainly increases the odds, and that's one of the intentions of the program, is to serve your local seniors through this program.
Right. Well, I would think that, speaking from the community's perspective, that the community, since these are community taxpayer dollars, they would prefer, if we're going to get involved with something like this, that we would want to target and focus this on our own residents. And you would
have that opportunity every time a unit sells. So you have the initial 2 buyers, but then you have generations of buyers for whom that would be true also. You'd have a local preference unit.
Right.
So, and you know, Hatfield is off the beaten trail. And so you're most likely to get interest from local residents or people from very nearby towns.
Right.
The other constituency that we see as being interested would be where the grown children of people are living in Hatfield and the parents are living at a distance, and the children want to bring their parents in their retirement to Hatfield to be close to their family. And that's a need that I would imagine is here in Hatfield as well.
I'm going to ask another question that's just kind of popped into my mind. Suppose there are Hatfield residents who are already living in this complex who would qualify income-wise and asset-wise for this program, but since they've already acquired the unit and may be finding that somewhat economically challenging, you know, is it possible for someone who is already in that complex to apply for the mortgage assistance program or the Biden? I mean, you know, you don't need to answer that right away, but
it is not the vision of the program.
Right.
I think I don't know that there would be necessarily a barrier to that person if they met the asset requirements, you know, the income requirements and all of those things, and they were willing to sell.
In effect, they'd end up refinancing their unit.
I don't anticipate that that's a likely scenario. You know, from what we understand, we did meet with the owner and list agent for the property, and it seemed like there were only a handful of Hatfield residents actually who had purchased in there.
I don't know what the...
and their experience is that they are turning away people who can't afford to buy those units.
Right.
So that was one of the conversations we had to try to see if there really would be demand for a program like this.
Yeah. I'm going to back off a bit and ask you another, I think, obvious question, and that is, okay, we've had, in a sense, $100,000 or so sitting in the community housing bucket, if you will, plus what's available in the general fund. From what I can gather, since we haven't directed much, if any, CPA money into the community housing side, you know, I don't know if we're getting any kind of direct or indirect pressure from the state to say, hey, Hatfield, you know, come on, we're giving you money. You got to start to do some of this stuff. What were the other options that we've considered as a community in terms of being able to apply some of the CPA funding to affordable housing efforts, if you will? You know, one of the questions that I had asked earlier to one of the other members that's involved was, you know, is there potential to expand the Capewalk project? Is there a need for some sort of improvements in that area, whether they be capital or just operational, restorative kinds of things? Could we use this money in other aspects of the community, which could be categorized as affordable housing? I guess, you know, you guys must have met and started to think about, you know, some options for this, and you've narrowed or focused on the Hatfield Village complex and 2 units there being a potential. What were some of the other options that you looked at for this kind of funding, and what might be some of the elements, the options going forward?
Well, we've been brainstorming. This has been going on for well over a year.
Yeah.
Okay, and we tossed around first and last in security deposits for, again, income eligible people if they wanted to rent an apartment.
Okay.
But, you know, that's a lot of management work. You know, if you have an apartment to rent, you know, it's going to be filled that month. Can't wait, you know, for town meeting and so on and so forth. We thought about maybe some energy projects, but then again, we'd only be helping a single individual. Where this, potentially, we could help dozens of people through this 99-year lease.
You mean over time?
Over time.
As
Over
these
time.
units turn
Yeah,
over, right?
yeah. And also, we at the Housing Authority, we're the state, okay? And the state really doesn't want to use the CPA, again, state CPA funding money to put into a state building.
Interesting. Even though it's located in a
Right.
community
right,
that...
right. The state has a
that-
whole criteria of things that, you know, they will allow and won't allow. And also, you know, our units at the Housing Authority are small.
Right.
Okay, we have a kitchen, living room combination. It's around 350 square feet
yeah.
for everything.
Yeah.
And there are 8 larger units, but they're on the second floor. They have basically one extra room. There's 8 of those units.
Right.
And then again, it's second floor. You know, the people may or may not have problems with the stairs. So this being, you know, 2 bedrooms, we could, you know, accommodate, you know, another whole group of potential tenants.
Right.
Right, we looked at the statistics at Capewalk and found that, was it 43 out of 44 households are single-person households?
Yes, we have actually
So, yeah,
two
Two-person units?
2 couples. But
Right.
then we looked at the data for Hatfield itself and found that maybe 66% of senior households are 2 people or larger. And so there was kind of a mismatch between
Oh, sure.
the population that's here
People
and the
living
available
longer.
senior housing stock.
Right.
A lot of seniors will say their primary disincentive for moving into senior housing is the size of units. It's a huge issue
Right.
because they tend to be
So
very
Mike, you're
small.
kind of saying that the option of expanding Capewalk, if it could be expanded, and adding some 2-bedroom units as opposed to, you know, the 1-bedroom units that we have now, and perhaps making units more accessible with handicap accessible with elevators or whatever to reach the is out of the question because
Basically,
the
the
state has said that they don't want to spend local.
local state funded money to
On
the
a
state
state-
again.
Right,
you know.
right. The other thing that, you know, we looked at, well, first of all, while it didn't take long for, you know, open space and historic preservation projects to start
Sure.
making its way to the committee.
Yeah.
We weren't getting any projects related to community housing. And so as Mike said, I mean, really about a year ago, the committee, working with the members on the Housing Authority, and we happen to have 2 members on our committee who are Housing Authority members,
Right.
Michael, and then one of John Wilkes, our at-large member, is also on the Housing Authority. So
Okay.
the committee as a group, the Community Preservation Committee, working with our 2 representatives from the Housing Authority, really started to do some research and dig into what other communities were doing around the state and locally to address the community housing category of CPA. And I think it's fair to say, Mike, that we felt like this was a good introductory project for us because, as Laura has pointed out, when all is said and done, while these units will stay on the town's tax rolls, the town will not have any ownership in the units. They won't have any ownership or maintenance responsibilities. So, for example, Northampton has done some single-room occupancy units, buildings, that their housing authority owns. And so,
they're off the tax rolls.
and they're continuing it, and they have to maintain them, they have to address them, they have to
Right.
have management associated with them. We felt like that was, you know, too much of a jump in the deep end, if you will, and this was maybe a toe in the kiddie pool end of the pool to sort of get ourselves started in the community housing area.
Right.
Right, I mean, I know you guys considered housing development, which tends to be complex and much more expensive. And so really on a scale, maybe not suited for this pot of money, which is finite. And I think that would be a much more challenging undertaking than really this is a program. It's not developing housing per se, it's just making it more affordable. It's taking housing that someone else is developing and making it more affordable. And so it's a lot less heavy lifting for the town than developing its own affordable housing would be.
We should point out too, with Laura here, that the idea would be, Laura mentioned the lottery earlier,
Right.
and then mentioned that their deed rider runs with the property, and so in subsequent sales, another lottery is done. The idea is that Valley CDC, Community Development Corporation, would be our partner in this, and they would manage the lottery. They would manage and monitor future resales.
The application process and all of that
Right.
would be handled by CDC.
Right.
Yeah, the town would essentially subcontract to Valley CDC to be its administering agent, and so really do the marketing and screening of applicants, manage the lottery, put together the sale, make sure all the paperwork is done properly with the state, which is a little voluminous, and kind of they have some expertise in that the town may not likely have. And then again, during the point of resale, the deed rider allows for 2% of the sales price to be used again for administrative activities. And so the town could again use Valley CDC to manage that so that it doesn't kind of come back 20, 30 years from now and no one knows what to do with it in town.
Yeah.
Right. Which is why we're looking at $125,000, correct, per unit.
Yep.
So that's $250, but the actual request from the Housing Authority is $270, $200, because that builds in those initial upfront costs associated with managing this and managing it by CDC. And then, as Laura said, the subsequent sales are dealt with through the 2% of the sales price at the time of those closings.
Okay. Right. So timing-wise, where is this at? I mean, I know it's, we'll get into how you're going to continue to communicate this to people, but just timing-wise, assume that this is approved at annual town meeting.
Right.
Then what happens? Are there units? I know that some of those units are under construction, some are completed.
Yes. There will be new units coming online this year. So the timing is relatively good.
Good, yeah.
If this is approved in the spring, Valley CDC would begin marketing right away to identify buyers who hopefully could purchase toward the end of the year, fall and winter. And we think the stars will align reasonably well to find the buyers and have the units coming to construction completion.
Right. How about the owner of the complex? I mean, obviously they're out using a realtor or realtors to sell these units at this point, and they're paying a commission when they sell.
Correct.
If Valley CDC goes out and finds potential buyers for these units, that's to their benefit. Is there any? If you approach them with any kind of cost sharing here, they would not have to pay a realtor's commission. Is that something that can be discussed with them in terms of, I mean, there's obviously a benefit to the developer there.
Yeah, we mainly feel like the relationship between the list agent and the developer is kind of their affair. The type of marketing that happens for this is pretty distinct from general real estate marketing. So we're really marketing a resource rather than, a housing unit. So I think they'll run in parallel track actually, that there'll be referrals back and forth, but the work done by Valley CDC is more about screening and income eligibility and deed riders and things like that are really separate from a traditional real estate transaction.
Right. But their realtor will not get a commission if on any units that are sold to this?
Again, I think it's going to be between the
I'll
owner and the
let you guys
realtor
work that out.
about whether they get a commission.
I'm pretty sure that the real estate agent will be getting a commission.
I would
That's
think so.
the business they're in, okay? So
Right.
they would obviously get their,
Yeah.
whatever the percent is at this time.
Right. Yeah. I
And
guess
just
my
a-
point is, if they're benefiting from the Valley CDC's efforts as we are, and we're contracting with Valley CDC to go out and find buyers for these units, it just seems like there's an opportunity there for some sort of interaction between Valley CDC and the realtor that's involved now with those units to see if there can, you know, maybe we don't have to pay you as much as.
Bob Cannon will say thank you very much.
I think there's
I
an
know.
advantage to the sellers in that
Yeah.
it broadens their market a bit. They have expressed to us their confidence that they will be able to sell the units with or without this type of program. They feel strongly that there's a market for the units.
Right.
And yet, they have also expressed willingness to work with the program, which is great. You know, it's a little bit of a mix because I think it could result in some additional paperwork for them to work with a program like this. So it's not just all, you know, to their benefit. It's a little bit of both, a little bit of probably some added steps that they wouldn't normally have to take.
Yeah, and Mike, just to go back,
sure.
With how this project came about, we were contacted, I was actually contacted by the town of Whately, and they want to set up a meeting with Whately, South Deerfield, Sunderland, Conway, and us, okay, to see what we're trying to do, you know, to satisfy our housing side.
Mm-hmm.
The meeting, have they ever scheduled this meeting?
They've been trying to organize it, but we've been in touch with them as to when we're available, but we haven't heard back.
To see whether or not
To
there may
see,
be some
to
sort of a
brainstorm, to
regional,
see
a collaborative.
if there's something else, okay, and they're interested in what we're trying to do.
Sure.
What as I've traveled through the small towns in the region, I have seen that they're all in a similar boat to Hatfield in terms of beginning to stockpile this community housing money, and none of them pretty much have done projects.
Yeah.
And partly because it's a complex world.
I was going to say, it's the most complicated
It is. It's complex. It can be
opportunity for those
can
monies.
be
I mean, it's not a simple.
controversial, and the amount of money for affordable housing development, $100,000 seems like a lot, but it doesn't buy much. And so,
Right.
what do you do with this relatively small pot of money that's going to make an impact in the world of housing?
Yeah.
And it's really has stymied the other small towns. So, applause to Hatfield for trying to get something going.
So let's talk about the timing. You said is pretty good. You know, if there are some people watching this that happen to, you know, all of a sudden they're saying, wow, maybe we should look into this. What's next? How can they get more information? How do they, you know, initiate some sort of contact going forward?
So Laura has worked with Jane Betzold to put up a small blurb in this month's seniors
Actually, it was in
newsletter.
There. Yes, it is in there.
And then Laura worked with the committee to put together a 2-page fact sheet, question and answer about the program. And these are now available at Town Hall. We'll be distributing them to the library and a few other the post offices, and also we're asking members of our committee at both the Congregational Church and at Holy Trinity to make them available, and perhaps an announcement made at one of the masses here between now and town meeting that they're available. We have 2 meetings coming up that people should be aware of. This Wednesday is the regularly scheduled monthly meeting of the Community Preservation Committee. This Wednesday, March 27th at 6 o'clock at Town Hall, we hold our monthly meeting, and this particular monthly meeting is our required public hearing on all 5 of the projects that we have presented to the board for town meeting warrant. Okay. And so there will be representatives from the committee, applications there to answer any questions. If the public would like to come and ask questions about any of the 5 projects and make their opinions and feedback known, which is helpful to the committee and the applicants as they prepare for town meeting. Right. But because of the complicated nature of this particular project, the one we're talking about, the housing senior housing mortgage assistance program, the committee, along with our partners, Valley CDC, are actually going to have an informational meeting just on this program, and that's Wednesday, April 24th at 6 p.m. Here at the Smith Academy Library. And so we would encourage anyone who has watched the program or picked up one of the flyers or seen the senior Council on Aging newsletter, and that's been noted in the Council on Aging newsletter, that we will be holding this informational meeting just on this program in April 24th, again, Wednesday, April 24th, at 6 o'clock at the Smith Academy Library.
And I would add, if people may be watching who want to apply to the program, it may be a little premature right at this moment. I think it would be nice to see it travel through town meeting,
It's going to get approved
become
first.
official.
Right.
And then at that point, Valley CDC would be kind of actively marketing and getting the word out in town. They would be the contact person for applicants. But it's a little soon to take in applications at this point until the town officially approves the program.
Okay. Just quickly, Laura, how complicated is an application for a mortgage assistance program? I'm assuming that you guys have got experience in this with other
Yes.
communities. So, I mean,
Yeah,
and does your organization provide assistance in
Absolutely.
completing some of these things? That
You know, the parallel example is kind of like applying for a loan from a bank. So
Right.
there is paperwork, there is documentation of things like income and assets. The staff at Valley CDC are really, have a lot of expertise helping people through the process. So they will do whatever it takes, whether it means driving to someone's house to meet with them, whatever services they need to help them get through the application stage. We would not want that to be a barrier for anybody who wants to apply.
Okay. So all of this kind of documentation already exists because you've used this in other communities?
Yes.
It's not something that has to all be created, someone has already, you don't want to have to
Thankfully,
recreate the
no.
wheel.
No. I mean, any application would be customized to a particular program.
Right.
But Valley CDC has done lots of marketing of affordable housing, so they've got, they've
All
got
that it takes.
boilerplate documents that
Yep.
would make it easy to kind of roll out a program here in Hatfield.
Okay. Anything else you guys want to share, either about the mortgage assistance program or the other 4 projects that town meeting will be talking
If somebody was
about?
watching this program, I'm sure, and wanted to contact Valley CDC, they would be more than willing to one-on-one talk with them.
Well, they could.
Advise them.
They
and-
could.
and-
It just, at this stage,
Prioritize.
it's a potential program
Right.
that hasn't really been formalized yet. So there's
Right.
no application form available today, but there would be shortly following the town meeting.
I'm assuming that one of the first things you would ask people who might be interested in this program to do is to go to town meeting and to help pass this at town meeting. Because if it does not pass at town meeting,
Right.
then it's just kaput, basically.
Hopefully that's why we're here,
Right.
to get the
Yeah.
word out so people can understand, what's going
Right.
on and the benefits and so on and so
Right, and
forth.
if people have concerns, give a number of points of opportunity, like this informational meeting, for people to come forward and at least understand it. They may or may not agree, but at least everybody has the information to evaluate it.
Well, hopefully between the Hatfield Currents show and the literature and your public hearing, they'll be pretty much fully informed going forward. There's always been the blurb in the senior housing communique that's gone out, so I think people are starting to build some awareness of this, and it'll be good to move forward with it. That's for sure. Well, I guess that's about all the time we have for today's Hatfield Currents. We've pretty much gone through and covered the gamut of what's on the docket as far as town meeting is concerned and the CPA program's funding. We want to thank Bob Wagner and Mike McGrath and Laura Baker for being here today. Any last thoughts from any of you before we close up?
Just come to town meeting and let's see if we can get this passed.
Yeah, Mike's right. I mean, the Community Preservation Act, the emphasis there is community, and that's what it's all about. And whether it's this project or any of the other ones, they all require town meeting approval to go forward. So it's a very collaborative and participatory process.
Great, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. For those of you watching, we want to thank you for having been with us. We hope you know a little bit more about our CPA program and how it works and some of the funding projects that you're going to be asked to vote on at annual town meeting. A couple of reminders. The annual town meeting is May 14th. It's Tuesday, May 14th at 7 p.m. at Smith Academy. Please attend, as those that do will be voting on close to $9 million of total appropriations. So if you want to say in how your money's being spent, particularly $9 million worth, you might want to attend our annual town meeting. Another reminder, Hatfield Currents is broadcast on HCTV Channel 15, and we are also available 24/7 on the web, and that's on YouTube/Hatfield Community TV. So look at Hatfield Community TV on the YouTube site, and you will see not only, or have access not only to Hatfield Current shows, but also all of the other meetings that are being taped in the community, and they're at your disposal, and you can watch them at your leisure. The other thing I wanted to remind you again is the public hearing that Bob mentioned. There'll be a public hearing on these projects and on this mortgage assistance project in particular on April 24th at, again, where was this?
So the meeting on April 24th is actually an informational meeting just on the mortgage assistance program.
All right.
And that's at 6 o'clock here at Smith Academy Library.
Okay.
And then we do have a public hearing on all of the projects that are being proposed for town meeting, and that's this Wednesday, March 27th at 6 p.m., and that's at Town Hall.
Yeah, great. Okay. Lastly, I want to thank the Hatfield Currents production team for all their help, especially John Novak, our station manager. We couldn't do it without him for sure. Again, thanks for joining us. I'm Mike Cahill. Watch yourself, Hatfield.